Sailors are known to have lots of strange customs while out at sea. Like some sailors believe that bananas are bad luck and so will not bring them on board their vessel, while other sailors believe it's good luck to throw one of their crew members overboard and then reel him back in before beginning a fishing trip that will enhance your chances of catching more fish. But while a lot of these customs of the sea are pretty harmless and kind of goofy, there's one custom of the sea that is not at all. It is extremely serious and very, very dark. It's known simply as the delicate question. And in short, once a sailor asks this delicate question under certain circumstances, there's no going back for that crew. And today we're going to learn about one of the most famous examples of this custom being carried out in real life. I will upload stories like this daily. So if that's of interest to you, please go through all the like buttons, social media posts, and correct their spelling and grammar in the comments section. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our daily uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of February 6, 1821, four young men stood on the deck of a small boat out in the Pacific Ocean. The sun was out. It was beautiful and warm. The water was crystal blue. But none of these four men were paying any attention to their surroundings. Instead, all of them were just standing there in total silence, staring at each other. Finally, one of the four men spoke up. His name was Owen Coffin, and he was 18 years old. And Owen, like the other three men, had grown up on the water. In fact, all four of these men had grown up on the small island called Nantucket, off the coast of Massachusetts, where the main industry there was whaling, which meant sailors like these four men would go out and hunt whales and slaughter them for their oil. So from the time Owen and the rest of these men were very little, they were out on the water learning how to sail, and they were also learning the customs of the sea. And there was one custom in particular that Owen wanted to talk about right now with the other three men. So in a very serious and hushed tone, Owen asked the question of the other three men that sailors referred to as the delicate question. And after Owen asked the so-called delicate question, the other three men, who were already very serious, and just kind of standing there in silence, suddenly their eyes started to go wide and their mouths went agape. And then again, all of the men just kind of fell into total silence. The only sound they could hear was the splashing of the waves against the side of the boat. The captain of this vessel was a man named George Pollard. He was 28 years old, and he was actually Owen's older cousin. And what George wanted to say to Owen in response to his delicate question was no. But George didn't say that. Instead, he just put his hands up over his mouth and stared kind of incredulously at Owen and the other two men, who were also teenagers. Their names were George and Barzillai, and as he stared at these other three men, he realized that their answers to the delicate question was a resounding yes. They knew it had to be a yes, they had to do this. And even though George could totally override them because he was the captain and so technically in charge, he knew in this situation, under this particular custom, he couldn't overrule them. And so, with his hands still over his mouth, George just nodded a yes. Yes, let's go forward with this custom. And so, with a unanimous decision to move forward, Owen slowly reached down and pulled out the ship's log book from underneath one of the seats behind him. And then he opened up a book and he flipped to the back pages of the log book, which were totally blank, and he grabbed one of the pieces of paper and he ripped it out of the book. Then Owen began to rip this piece of paper into strips. First he ripped 3 identically long pieces of paper, and he held up all 3 at the same time to show the others that these are the 3 that are the same. And each of the 3 nodded their head yes. We see that. And then Owen reached down. He grabbed the paper again, and he ripped a 4th strip out. And this one was dramatically shorter than the other 3. And so Owen held up this much shorter piece, and he showed Charles, George, and Barzillai. And again, they all kind of nodded in agreement. Yes, we see. That's the short piece. And so once the whole group was satisfied that they had their 4 strips, Owen took off his hat. He put all 4 strips inside, mixed it around, and held out his hat. It was time. The first man to reach into Owen's hat was Owen's older cousin and the captain George. He reached in. He pulled one of the strips of paper out, closed it in his fist so he had no idea which one it was, and pulled it back and held it close to his chest. And then, one by one, each of the other men did the same thing, reaching in, grabbing their strip, not looking at it, and holding it against their chest. And then, once all the strips had been taken at the exact same time, all 4 men extended their hands into the middle of the circle they were standing in, and they opened their hands palm up to reveal which strip they got. And George, Charles, and Barzillai all had the identical long pieces. And Owen, the 18-year-old, the younger cousin of the captain, the one who had ripped up the strips, he had the short strip, and immediately when his older cousin George saw this, he yelled out, "No, let me take that one." But Owen said, "No, this is customary. I want this." And so after a few moments of the men kind of collecting themselves and calming down, Charles then grabbed the log book again, flipped to the back of it, pulled out another blank page, and he ripped it into strips again. Except now he was only ripping them into 3 strips, 2 long that were identical, and 1 short. And once again, as he ripped them, he held them up to show the other men to show this was a fair process. Then Charles took off his hat, put the 3 strips inside and extended it to George and Barzillai. Owen was not a part of this round. And so George and Barzillai, one by one, reached in, took their strip, held it to their chest, and then Charles, he would take the last strip. He would hold it to his chest. And then, once all the men had their pieces, they held their hands out into the middle of their now smaller circle. They opened their hands palm up, and this time it would be Charles, the man who ripped up this second round, who would discover he had the short strip. And as soon as Charles saw this, he threw it on the ground and he ran to the other side of the boat and began screaming, "I can't do this! I can't do it!" Meanwhile, Owen, George, and Barzillai didn't even move or flinch. They just stood there waiting for Charles to calm down because they knew. He knew this was a very important custom, and once you begin doing it, you can't just stop. Charles would have to come back over and play his role. And so after a few minutes of Charles still kind of calling out that he couldn't do this, tears are coming down his face. He finally wiped the tears, he calmed himself down, and he walked back over to the group who again, they hadn't moved. George, Barzillai, and Owen. They're just standing there waiting to continue this custom. And so, as Charles began coming back over, looking ready to continue, George, without even saying anything, reached down and unlatched a door on the side of the boat. He opened it up. He reached in, and he pulled out this long object that was wrapped in canvas. And then he handed this object to Charles. And then, once Charles had possession of this object, Owen, the man who had first drawn the short piece of paper, said to the group, "Now it's time for a moment of silence," even though at this point none of the men were talking. But still they formed a tight circle with Charles holding this object, and they all bowed their heads, and they just stood there in total silence. And then, once Owen raised his head, the other 3 did as well, and Owen, one by one, touched the shoulders of each of the men and reminded them that this had been a fair process. Then, without saying another word, Owen turned away from the group. He walked over to the edge of the boat, looking out over the water. He got down on his knees. He made sure his posture was good, and he looked out over the water. Owen had always loved the ocean, even though his own father had died out at sea. But this particular whaling expedition that Owen had been on, he thought went extremely well, and he was very proud of what they had all accomplished. And Owen was especially proud to be a part of this particular custom. This custom was one that so few people ever took part in, but all sailors knew about it. It was kind of like the forbidden custom. And here he was playing a central role which really required a lot of strength. And so, feeling very proud of himself, Owen, after looking out over the water for a few more moments, he bent down and put his chin on the edge of the boat, which signaled to Charles it was time. And then once Charles saw that Owen was in position, he stepped away from George and Barzillai and walked over to Owen carrying this object wrapped in canvas. And then, once he was right behind Owen, without saying a word to him, he unwrapped the object and it was a rifle. Once the rifle was uncovered, he placed the barrel against the back of Owen's head. And then he fired a shot, and instantly Owen slopped to the ground dead, and Charles kind of staggered back and fell on the deck and let out the strangled scream. He couldn't believe what he had just done, but he knew there was no other choice. Once they decided to do this sacred custom, they had to take it to the end. And so George, who had just witnessed the execution of his younger cousin, was deeply troubled and pained. But he too knew they had to bring this custom to the finish line, which meant it was George's turn to step forward and play his part. And so George walked up to his now dead younger cousin, and George pulled out a serrated knife and cut off Owen's head. And then once Owen's head was removed, he placed it on the deck. So Owen's face was looking away from the other men, like he couldn't see what they were going to do. And then once the head was in place, George went back to Owen's body and began cutting him open and pulling his organs out and handing them to Charles and Barzillai. George also began cutting off long strips of Owen's flesh, creating sort of like fillets. And then, even though there was a spot on the boat to have a fire, the three men decided they just could not wait. And before long, the only sound that could be heard on board this little boat floating out at sea on the Pacific Ocean was the sound of Charles, George, and Barzillai tearing into Owen's raw flesh with their teeth, turning their beards bright red with his blood. The delicate question that Owen asked the other men at the beginning of this story was one of the most feared questions among sailors. And it was only asked if there was a shipwreck, or some sort of emergency that happened out at sea, which meant the group had almost no chance of survival. Only in those circumstances was the delicate question appropriate, and what it was do we draw lots to determine which one of us dies so the other can eat them in order to have a better chance at survival. And so during that first round, when Owen had drawn the short strip of paper, that determined he would be the one who was murdered and eaten. And then, in the second round, when Charles drew the short strip of paper, that meant he would be the one to kill Owen. On February 6, 1821, the day that Owen posed the delicate question, he and the other three men had been lost at sea for the past 3 months after a whale had struck the side of their whaling boat and left them adrift with almost no food and no water. There had been other 4 men on board the Essex who had died from starvation and exposure, and their bodies had been consumed by the surviving sailors until on February 6 they were down to just these 4 men and no more bodies to eat. Which is why they decided it was time they had to ask the delicate question. 17 days after Owen sacrificed himself so the others could eat him, another boat happened to drift past the stranded Essex boat, which now only contained Charles and George. Barzillai had died of starvation 5 days after they killed Owen, and Barzillai had been eaten by George and Charles as well. And as this other ship passed by the Essex and they looked on board, all they saw were skeletons of the men that had died and been eaten. And Charles and George were on opposite ends of the boat, curled up in a ball chewing on human finger bones, trying to get the last bits of flesh off. And their bodies were totally emaciated, their hair and their beards were wild. They looked totally feral. And then when this boat actually came up alongside the Essex and boarded to rescue Charles and George looked terrified. It was like they had totally lost their grip on reality. They had been lost at sea for 94 days and had consumed all of their friends. And so it makes sense. They might go kind of crazy. But after this crew was able to get Charles and George fed and get them water and cleaned up, they kind of regained their composure and their sanity, and they were very thankful and happy to be alive. The story of what happened to the crew of the Essex quickly spread all around the world, and in fact it served as inspiration for Herman Melville to write his classic American novel Moby Dick. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel.